So just a bit of explanation of what we're doing. The church history study we've been doing does not cover the Crusades. They kind of mention it and just go right past it. And so I thought, okay, well, we need to cover the Crusades. That's a pretty big part of stuff that happened. So that's what we're going to do. I didn't have any paper to hand out. Sorry, I don't have anything for you. But I do have a presentation that I hope is going to help out some. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this period of time known as the Crusades, because there's a lot of myth and misconception and kind of like popular ideas out there that are just wrong, especially following 9/11. You had a lot of people who were saying things like, oh, well, Christians, they had their bad things they did too. Look at the Crusades, and you hear people talking about the Crusades being an invasion to take over, those poor innocent Muslims over there. We're just trying to go colonize. And that's really not what the Crusades were about. A lot of really bad things did happen during the Crusades, but that's not what they were about. And so we're going to try to hold on a second. I'm having camera issues. Okay, there we go. That's better. So we're going to take a look at what actually happened, what led to the Crusades. Because it's not like European Christians were just sitting around and decided, hey, let's go invade, the Holy Land. There was things that led up to it. So let's just start out. My pointer's on. There we go. What is a crusade? It comes from the Latin word for cross. And it kind of means to the cross or for the cross, depending on how you translate it. Generally speaking, a crusade is just a campaign for the cross. That's why Billy Graham called his revivals crusades, because it was something being done for the cross. The cross was the focus. Christ was the main point. Specifically, when someone refers to the Crusades, what they're talking about is this series of military campaigns that happened from Western, European kingdoms going over to the Middle East between 1195 and 1291. They're going to retake the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and that area from the Muslims. And so that's usually what people are talking about when they refer to the Crusades. That's it. So if we take a look at what the Crusades, well, what are they? What were the people then? What was in their mind? What were they thinking that they were doing? First off, the Crusades were a pilgrimage. You had people who would travel to the Holy Land, right? It was a very common thing for Christians to travel to Jerusalem, to travel to Israel, just like we do today. It had a whole lot more religious significance to them back then. Like Muslims go to Mecca, Christians would go to Jerusalem. I mean, it was a big thing that people would do. And so the Crusades were partly that they were going to the Holy Land, to the place where Jesus was crucified. But they also included this idea of holy war, that we are doing the work of God, that we need to go defeat God's enemies. And so you had the original Christians were, some were maybe even pacifists, but they were at least, military was not the way Christianity spread. Right? We looked at that in our earlier studies on church history. It's just not what the church did. But then around 400 AD, Augustine developed the doctrine of just war theory, where there could be good, moral, justified reasons to go to war. And then that kind of developed over time. And you had Europe, which was real feudal and warlike, with the knights and all these different kingdoms fighting. And so war kind of developed into this different kind of thing. And so whenever the Pope calls for Christians to go march on the Holy Land, it kind of made sense to them that those were the enemies of God, and we need to go fight them. And so that was wrapped up in there. But then also you had this idea of penance, right? If you look at the progression we've been going through, where the church has developed into the kind of authority, right? Where the church stands there and says, I will tell you what is true. I will tell you what is right. I am Jesus's presence on this earth, is how the church would prescribe it. Then whenever the church says, you are forgiven, you're forgiven. And if the church says, you're not forgiven, then you're not forgiven. And whenever the Crusades started, there was this idea that if you go do this, you get what was called a plenary indulgence. You're just forgiven. No time in purgatory. When you die, you go straight to paradise. And so you have criminals and knights who are not, like King Arthur in the stories we hear. They were actually pretty brutal, pretty bad guys. They were professional soldiers. So you have knights and criminals and mercenaries, people who have a lot of things they want to be forgiven for. And they're told that if they go fight in this war, they just get a straight ticket to heaven, and all is forgiven. Then yeah, they're going to sign me up. Let's go. And so you have all of that coming together to kind of form kind of the attitude and the mindset of what is going on in the Crusades. So why did they happen? Right? Like I said, it's not just that the Europeans just decided one day they needed to go conquer Jerusalem. Things led up to this. There were things in history that was going on, specifically in three areas. In the Roman Empire, right? The events of the Roman Empire kind of set the stage for it. The events we've talked about in the church, including the Great Schism, they set the stage for it. And then the development and the conquest of Islam set the stage for it. And they all lead into why this happens. So first off, with the Roman Empire, right? It starts out controlling everything around the Mediterranean, into the Middle East, down into Egypt and North Africa, all the way up into Britain. And so the Roman Empire is controlling all of this. But then remember, there's a split. Whenever Constantine moves the capital from Rome to Constantinople, now you have the power in the east, but you still have a lot of focus in the west, because there's a lot of power and a lot of focus in the west. And you essentially get a split empire, because eventually what ended up happening, remember in 800 AD is whenever the Pope crowned Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. He wasn't an emperor and it wasn't Roman. He was actually a Frank. But the idea now is you have the European kind of empire, even though it's not an empire. It's all these different kingdoms. But then you have the East. And the East thought that they were the inheritors of the Roman Empire, including the West. And the West thought they were the inheritors of the Roman Empire. And so you have this split where you have two kind of sides of the empire, and they didn't really trust each other. There actually, a lot of times, they had battles over territory of who was actually in control of different places. Then you have the Great Schism that we talked about last week, where in 1054, the Pope in Rome and the Archbishop in Constantinople had a disagreement, and they got mad, excommunicated each other. So that basically you have this division with the Roman Catholic Church in the West, and then the Eastern Orthodox churches in the East. And they do not like each other, they do not get along. They still largely view each other as, okay, well, those are our fellow Christians, our brothers, they're over there, but there was this division. And then you have the rise of Islam. It's not just that you have some nice, peaceful Arabs sitting over there minding their own business. Islam actually came on the stage and is the backdrop for why all of this set up and came to be. And so I have here, it's going to be a map that you're going to see the progression of the spread of Islam. It's going to start down in what is now Saudi Arabia, where Muhammad started, and you're just going to see it spread around and take over most of what was the Roman Empire. You'll see it kind of change in different colors. That's different Muslim kingdoms. They weren't one unified empire. They had different kingdoms. And then that arrow, the red arrow, points to where Constantinople is. And that's going to be important because that's what ends up causing the First Crusade, as we'll see. So it's not just that the Muslims are sitting over there in the Middle East. You actually have this progression. You see a green, that's them just taking over all that area, and some other little kingdoms form up, and they conquer each other, and power spreads around, and it comes and goes and fluctuates over time. And so you see, it's not just that there's some peaceful Arabs over in the Middle East. This is a conquering people. They're invading all of these lands and turning them Muslim or making them pay a tax to live in their area. And you see they spread really quickly, and it continues on for centuries. And one thing you notice is early on, the area over there in the Middle East, my arrow's not pointing. Work? No, can't see on the TV. You'll see here in a minute where this orange color, the kingdom, representing the kingdom of the Seljuk Turks, is just going to sweep down. It's going to take over. It's going to push all the way almost to Constantinople, which is, I can't reach. It's right up there where the Mediterranean meets that other sea right above it. And so, here, watch this orange kind of pops up there on the right-hand side, and then it's just going to sweep through. It's going to go all the way into that white area. Is where the Byzantine Empire is, and they just push in there and conquer all this land. And right about there is where the Crusades began. And you see it kind of pushes back a little bit more. But so the idea is that this didn't just happen out of nowhere. For centuries, the Islamic world had been pushing into the Roman, conquering everything. You see, they even come up into Spain, and sometimes they were even in control of some areas of southern France. So what ends up happening is, whenever that Muslim kingdom comes in, and it just sweeps through and takes over a very large portion of the Byzantine Empire, the emperor, Emperor Alexius I, he calls on Rome. He calls on the West. He calls on Europe. He says, look, we're still brothers. I know we had that great schism thing, and so we have that, but we're still all followers of Christ. Can you please come help? The Muslims on our doorstep, because they had taken over all the way up to the town of Nicaea, which was about 100 miles away from Constantinople. So it'd be like we're sitting here, and let's say there's an invading army, and they're up in Dallas. They're that close, right? It won't take them much time at all to come down here and wipe us out. And so they're calling Europe, and they're saying, hey, can you help? So the Pope, who I believe at the time was Pope Urban II, he calls for help. He says, let's help. The East is calling for our help, so let's do it. And he calls for Crusaders, and he gives this big rousing sermon at a council. A big speech where he just stirs everybody up, a big powerful call to arms. And the purpose, though, this is the thing that a lot of people miss, the purpose was just to go help. It was not conquest. It was not riches. It was only, those are our allies, and they need some reinforcements. That's all that was being called for. And so Europe rallies an army. They had preachers going around Europe preaching this message of crusade, rah, rah, let's go help out the Byzantines. And they get a big army, something like 120,000, 130,000, something like that set out and marched towards Constantinople. And most of them did not make it. You had a lot of people either left or died along the way. But they get to Constantinople, and the emperor He says, okay, guys, you're here for us, so you're not here to conquer, so I need you to make an oath. And the Crusaders had to make an oath that whatever land they conquer is for Constantinople. It's for the emperor. They don't get to keep it. It's not for Europe. It's for the Byzantium Empire. And so they have to swear that. They have to swear allegiance to the emperor because they're to fight on his behalf. And the first crusade is very successful. It meets all of these stated mission objectives. They go down, they invade and sack the town of Nicaea and liberate it from the Muslims. And then they push even further down to Antioch and they free that. So they basically end up pushing the Turks out of Asia Minor. And so they reclaim that land, right? Mission completed. That's what the emperor asked for help with. But the European Crusaders, they already had their mindset on the Holy Land. They were all stirred up about Muslims who were occupying Jerusalem. And so they get it in their mind that they need to go down and liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims. Remember, Rome thinks it is the embodiment of Christ on earth, and the Roman Empire used to control that area. So in their minds, they think that's our land. That should be Christian land. So let's go get it back let's go liberate it from its Islamic oppressors. So they're not just thinking conquest and gold and glory and, imperialism and setting up. They're thinking we need to go rescue those people from their invaders, is the way the Crusaders viewed it. So they go down and they sack Jerusalem and they end up taking over and several, Jerusalem and other parts of Israel. And Byzantine Empire is not happy. It's not what they wanted. Now here you have European Catholic kingdoms set up right in their backyard. And so it even further stresses the tensions between the East and the West. But generally it's seen as a success. And then they took over Jerusalem. Well, now you would think that was that. Well done, guys. Let's go home. But you can't just go home because you've now conquered a land. You have to occupy it. That takes money. That takes troops. That takes, you're setting up a kingdom. And so this is actually where you get groups like the Knights Templar. And another common, lesser well-known, but group that was there also were the Knights Hospitaller. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce it. It's hospital with an ER. So their main job was to protect pilgrims coming to Jerusalem. That's the primary thing that the Knights Templar and other groups like them started out to do, was to defend Jerusalem and protect pilgrims. They got their name because when they invaded, they took a mosque that was sitting on the Temple Mount. They conquered it and made it their headquarters. So they were the Knights of the Temple because their headquarters was sitting on the Temple Mount. So that's where they got their name. So there's where it sits, there's where it stands. You would think, okay, we're done. But now Europe has an investment in the Holy Land. They now have in their mindset, in their culture, their way of thinking, that is Christian land, that's their land. They have a responsibility to protect it. And so what ends up happening is let's see if I get my crusades right. The second crusade that gets called, there's a little kingdom north of Israel that's called Edessa, like Odessa, but with an E, so Edessa. And the Turks come and they take that over. And so the Pope calls for a crusade. We have to go rescue, Edessa. The emperor over in Constantinople, not happy. He doesn't want them there. He didn't ask for them there. He wants them to stay out, but they don't. They come in anyway. They fail. They do not take back Edessa. And since they didn't succeed at that, they look around and go, okay, well, what can we do while we're here? And they decide to go attack Damascus, which was generally an ally of the Crusader kingdoms. So anyway, they go to attack Damascus, and it is a total failure. They don't have enough troops, and the city of Damascus has more supplies than the Crusaders do. And if you're going to do a siege, you have to surround a town and starve them out. Well, it doesn't work because they don't have enough troops to surround the town, and the town has more supplies than they do. So eventually, they just kind of, hold on. Eventually just kind of fizzles out. Trying to make sure I get my battles clear. So that was the Second Crusade. It kind of just fizzled out with a little whimper, and it didn't accomplish anything, except for to anger the emperor. And so now the East and the West are even more at odds. The Third Crusade is the one most people know about. That's the one that involved Richard the Lionheart of England. If you ever watch any movie that romanticizes, this epic battle of good and evil of the Crusades, it was probably about the Third Crusade. There was he wasn't a Turk, he was from a different Muslim kingdom. His name was Saladin. And he was a brilliant leader, and he came in and he just took over Jerusalem. All those kingdoms around there, he came in and he conquered them. And so once again, the Pope calls for crusade. We must go rescue Jerusalem. And Richard the Lionheart and several other kings mount their armies, and off they go, and they never succeed. They recapture some lands. They don't get Jerusalem. And then Richard has to go home because of, Robin Hood and all that.
King Richard back from the Crusades.
Boy, now I'm in trouble.
Political things and people trying to undermine his throne, different things going on. And so that just kind of ends in a stalemate. It's kind of a draw. The Crusaders took back a little bit of territory. Saladin still has Jerusalem. But he promises, okay, let's just call it a truce, and I'll let pilgrims come to Jerusalem. So he's still allowing, Christians can come and go to their holy sites and go, do their prayers and visit their, different places we like to go to. And so that's how that one ended. Then, after Saladin dies, the guy who takes over after him is not so nice. And he starts tearing down Christian sites. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was built on the place where it's believed was the tomb of Jesus. They tear that down. They start burning, relics. And so, once again, Pope calls for a crusade, and off they go with the Fourth Crusade. The problem is they never actually make it to Jerusalem. Because of financing reasons and other political issues, they detour and they go to Constantinople rather than going on to Jerusalem because they ain't got any money. And it takes money to feed an army. Well, while they're in Constantinople, they get involved in local politics, and the Crusader army from Europe ends up attacking Constantinople. They pillage the town. I don't remember if they chase out or kill the emperor and replace him with a new emperor who is friendly to Europe. So, and the rest of the Eastern Empire view him as a Catholic puppet. And so there's a lot of back and forth there. So that's kind of how that crusade ends. So those are the big four. Those are the ones that kind of set the whole scene. Those are the ones that really are where all the major action happens in the Crusades. There are a few others worth mentioning, but that right there really fractures even further the relationships between the East and the West. However, you would think that would be the end of it, but it's not. There are several more crusades that do various things, not all in the Holy Land. Christianity now has this idea in its head in Europe, this mythos, this kind of cultural identity of where they are the holy crusaders who are supposed to right the wrongs and vanquish God's enemies. And so you end up having things where you get a crusade in Spain, where the Pope calls for a crusade, and it's actually successful. They go and they liberate Spain and drive out the Islamic, people who've been there for hundreds of years. But they go and free Spain from the Muslim occupiers and reestablish it as a Christian nation. You have a group of heretics up, I think around Switzerland, that the Pope declares a crusade and armies go march and, wipe them out because they're heretics. And so you have several of these kind of little things that go on because they have this idea that those are the enemies of God. And if I go fight the enemies of God, one, I'm fighting the enemies of God. And two, I get to go straight to heaven. And so he's got all this idea, and it lasts for a few hundred years. The most tragic one is what is called the Children's Crusade. What ends up happening is some children, no one knows why. There's no explanation of it in history. They start this protest. Children just marching, protesting because Jerusalem is in the hands of the Muslims and we have to go rescue it. But none of the kings are listening. The Pope's not listening. Everyone's just saying, no, go home, go away. So the children, tens of thousands of children from all over Europe just start marching off to the Holy Land because they're going to go save Jerusalem. And you're talking anywhere from age like 14 and 15 down to age 6. Thousands of children. Estimates range from 7,000 to 30,000 on the high end. Probably somewhere more around 10 to 15. But no one knows what happens to them. About the time they reach somewhere right around Italy, they vanish. Most likely, maybe either wandered back home or got captured and sold into slavery, because it's just a whole bunch of kids on their own, without adults, marching, to the Holy Land. And so, and that brings us up to about the time of the Reformation, which we'll get into next week, where there was almost a crusade called because the Muslims had kind of gone through Constantinople, and they're coming up through Eastern Europe, what we know as the Soviet bloc, Eastern European countries. But then the Reformation happened, and so that all kind of, that was about the end of the Crusades, is right around 1500. And so that's what you have. Just all this time and time again where, they're looking, they're going, oh, we need to go rescue. And that's the thing. A lot of people say, oh, the Crusades, those mean, bloodthirsty Europeans going over there to pick on the Muslims. In their mind, they were rescuing the Holy Land. They were rescuing Jerusalem. In their minds, that was theirs, and they were getting rid of the invaders. And so it wasn't this conquest, bloodthirsty thing. The horrible things did happen, and people did all kinds of terrible, atrocious things. So that's the Crusades in a nutshell. There are some implications I think they have for us today and kind of how history unfolds. Do you have any questions about any of that so far? That's.
It sounds a whole lot like what's going on today.
It sounds a whole lot like what's going on today.
Kuwait, Iraq, Iran.
Yeah. So it's just this never-ending struggle between worldviews, and ideas. And so, so the Crusades take place, and it's not just that they happened and they were over. There were certain ideas, I think, that really embedded themselves in the European mindset that, one, I think, gave rise to the Reformation. I think the mindset of the Crusades is one of the things that led to the Reformation, because it really solidified during that time, about 400 years, it was really solidifying the idea in people's minds that the church is in charge, the church decides if I go to heaven or not, the church can forgive me, I go to the church, and what the Pope says, what the church says, that's what goes. And that mindset really solidified and developed during this Crusade time. And then so I think that's part of what gave rise to the Reformation. because Martin Luther and others like him started, like they woke up and said, wait, hold, time out. No, that's not what the Bible says. And so there's that. There's also a lot of this idea of I need to fight the enemies of God. Even in our culture today, you see attitudes of hate. You get the like Westboro Baptist type people, and you'll see people who just say all kinds of hateful things against a group, wanting, we need to punish them, we need to get them, they're the enemies. And I think a lot of that theologically developed around this idea of crusade. Those Muslims, they're the enemies. Let's go get them. Let's go free Jerusalem. They're the bad guys. And so I think a lot of that mindset of God wants me to fight those evildoers is where that developed. But again, that's not in the Bible. The Bible doesn't teach us to go fight our enemies. It says to love our enemies, pray for our enemies, bless our enemies. And so I think a lot of that is kind of the heritage, the holdover from the Crusader mindset. And it also continues to breed the division between the East and the West, which only recently, like as recent as the last 50 years, has started to lessen to where the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox come together. That is the Crusades. Very quick overview, Crusades in a nutshell, and I think the impact that they had. We do need to understand, I'm not trying to, like whenever I say they weren't invasions and conquest, I'm not trying to defend it, I'm not trying to justify it, because people did really horrible things. There was one of them, I forget which one, where along the way they decided they were going to go over, they took a detour out of their way to go wipe out some Jewish villages because, they're Jews, they killed Jesus. And so, there were horrible things that happened in the Crusades. You have 50,000 people marching, they need food, so you come through an area and you just pillage. You just go into houses and take people's food because you need to eat. And, horrible things would happen. So, I don't want to justify them or defend them, but we also need to understand them, why they happened, the context they happened in, and that at least initially, the motivation wasn't, let's go conquer. It was, we need to go help our friends and allies and brothers in the East who are under attack. And then it just went off the rails from there and turned into this whole big other thing.